I'm Jim Schaefer, the producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Bobbi Low, who's here to discuss her book, Why Sex Matters, a Darwinian look at human behavior. Bobbi, this book proved to be a really fascinating read. It has so many kinds of intriguing insights into the question of looking at Darwinian theory and human behavior that I could barely put it down. Perhaps for the sake of the readers, we could define a few important concepts here, like the notions of behavioral and evolutionary ecology.
Sure, Jim. Behavioral and evolutionary ecology are relatively new ways of looking at behavior, including human behavior. They're unusual in that they put together two things that no approaches have done previously. First, the influence of the environment. It depends on the environment whether it's profitable to do this or that. Second, both these approaches add genes as a sort of currency. They ask about individual genetic costs and benefits of doing this or that behavior in this or that environment. They may differ a little on time scale. I consider myself mostly a behavioral ecologist, and so I'm mostly looking at behavior now in a particular environment. But evolutionary ecology asks about how those costs and benefits add up over time, and do they result in changes over time.
One of the things that people always think about with Darwinian theory is apes and animals. And one of the interesting things about your book is you clearly say we need to take a look at this behavioral patterns in terms of human beings.
That's true, and yet we're still, as Jared Diamond once called us, the third chimpanzee. There are very clear links showing that our behavior is related to, similar to, the behavior of other apes. And in fact, at some point, there are very social, very complicated things we humans do that I could describe identical behaviors in chimpanzees. And if I didn't tell you it was chimpanzees, you would think I was talking about humans. We're that similar, and yet we're unusual. It's a very interesting thing. We're kind of a funny ape, if you will, because we are so very social, and that does change a lot. For instance, if we weaned our babies on the same sort of pattern as other primates, we would nurse our kids till they were 7 or 8 years old. We don't. We wait longer to begin having children. We have them closer together. We stop earlier in our lifetimes. Menopause leaves women with about 30% of their lifespan in which they don't produce any more children. For most other mammals, it's about 10%. So we're very common in some ways and very strange in others.
How did you go about doing this research?
I drifted into it. A sort of hidden, dirty secret in my background is that I really am a biologist. I worked on the biochemical systematics of toad skin secretions for my dissertation. But about 21 years ago, I had a new baby. I was divorced. I was working on digger wasps, little fast-moving wasps that zip out and catch robber flies and then paralyze them and lay an egg on them. And my son was 2 months old. I was schlepping him out to the site. He was unhappy. I was miserable. And I said, I have to do something on the computer after he goes to bed at night. So I began looking at cross-cultural patterns in human behavior. Then I began to ask questions about how patterns changed, and that drew me into doing 19th century demography, looking at, I tell my students, I look at the sex lives of long dead Swedes. And so it just grew.
That could be exciting.
They've been dead a while. It is interesting. But it just grew because human behavior and the complexity of human behavior is just fascinating.
But you really are saying, let's just look at the behavior as it is, and not these emotional or other aspects of it. Say, let's study ourselves as...
I really do begin by saying, what would a biologist think and predict about the behavior of this organism if she only knew that they were a very smart, highly social, upright walking primate, nothing more. So in fact, I don't work on some very interesting parts of human behavior because my background in this approach are simply about what does one predict to be genetically profitable, what do you find?
So then you got into this aspect of sexual behavior.
Well, sex is almost more fun to look at than any other part of behavior. In other species, sometimes it's the most interesting because it's the thing that's really worth taking risks for. So if you're watching the behavior of other species, you're liable to see, particularly males, doing risky things. And it's harder to get data on other kinds of behavior. This is really at the heart of the whole book, because once you figure out why there is sexual reproduction, why most sexual species only have 2 sexes instead of 3 or 6 or 10, and then you're led to why, almost always, the 2 sexes follow very, very different strategies to succeed in their lives.
Well, and you follow that through a number of examples about how the 2 sexes have, that there are 2 sexes and that they have this identifying behavior.
Yes, and it's really an interesting problem. It falls out. There are 2 main theories about once there are 2 sexes, why they tend to be as they almost universally are. And they're not exclusive. Both are probably true. One of them is the sheer physics. Look at it this way. To make a successful baby in a sexual species, there are 2 things you must do. You must get your gamete, which only has half the required number of genes in it, to meet up with another one. And that resulting baby, embryo, must be robust and vigorous and competitive. Well, it turns out that little bitty gametes work better than middle-sized or large ones in bumping into other gametes. And if you are a little gamete maker, then anything you can do to enhance that advantage, you will be favored for doing. On the other hand, the advantage to large gametes is that they contribute to real robust, vigorous offspring. If you're a big gamete maker, you lose a lot if you take risks and die. So very quickly you get specialists in finding others, and we tend to call them males. And they not only make little gametes, but they put tails on them and little organelles to move them. And females, who are typically in most species risk-averse and very shy,
What other examples did you have of this as you were doing your research?
Well, there are a couple of classics among the mammals because people have worked on them for 20 and 30 years. And they know all the individuals and they know all their lifetimes. Elephant seals are one of the great examples. And they're a good example of the sort of default condition in mammals. Elephant seal females spend much of the year out at sea, but they need to come in and find a sandy beach on which to give birth. To do that, they come in, they seek a place, they look for the sandy beaches. The males come in beforehand, fight with each other to control these beaches, and then when a female comes in, she chooses a beach and willy-nilly gets the guy who controls it. Now the males don't even recognize their own offspring. They are simply specialized to come in, fight other males, be very aggressive, mate with females. And in fact, there are known occasions of them killing their own babies as they go galumphing to fight another male. Now, the trade-offs are really different. Most males never get a mating. More than 4 out of 5 elephant seal males die without ever getting a mating. On the other hand, the most successful male in the series of studies had more than 90 offspring. Females mature earlier, reproduce longer, and fairly reliably make a baby a year. A lot of females fail to reproduce, but not after they reach adulthood. But the most successful female in her lifetime makes about 10 offspring. So being a male, and in fact making a son, in most mammals is a high-risk, high-gain strategy. Males who don't take these risks get nothing, get nowhere. Males who do are likely to fail, but after all, you have a 1 in 5 chance of winning the lottery if you really work at it, and a 0 chance if you don't.
Well, in those remarks, too, you're pointing toward this evolutionary process where the survival of the fittest, or the survival of the fittest characteristics, I should say, are the ones that start influencing then the shape of what is happening.
True, and it's easier for us to see it in other species, but in fact, it's true for us too. There's a terrible old joke about a man who wants to buy a bull for his cattle herd, and he's a little uneasy and he asks the seller, "What about this bull's potency?" And the seller looks at him and says, "Look, I can tell you this. He comes from a long line of fertile ancestors. And even though we don't think about it, and it's not part of what we imagine ourselves as designed to do, it is part of our evolutionary history."
Have you run into any issues with feminists about looking at just this aspect?
I've been blessedly lucky in that. Several of my students are feminists and doing things like getting certificates in women's studies. And I think we look at it like this. I consider myself a feminist, and I'm old enough to have gone through the periods when women really didn't get paid the same as men, and have had a few battles along the way. But in fact, if our backgrounds are different, and if we carry some old tendencies to behave differently, then as far as I'm concerned, I'd rather know what those differences are and then be able to make informed decisions about what to do about it. Natural selection is amoral, if you will. What we see organisms doing today is largely a function of what worked in particular environments in the past. So if we change the environment and those things don't function very well, it's nice to know where we came from and what we're up against if we decide to choose things.
I would think it'd help to have some kind of factual basis as far as, which sometimes punctures a lot of, bloated notions of what is going on if you really do study what is going on.
I think it helps. And I think it helps to study not only our society, but societies cross-culturally and other species. Because many times things we imagine are purely cultural and just something that's part of our society's way of doing things, in fact, turn out to be very widespread. Other times, for example, we imagine that we train boys and girls differently, and we do. But societies cross-culturally train boys and girls differently, and in many of them, little girls are trained much more to be obedient than in ours. In almost all of them, they're trained to be sexually restrained. In most of them, the woman, a girl when she reaches her teens and is marriageable, doesn't get to choose her husband. In about a third of societies in what's called the standard cross-cultural sample. It's sort of a worldwide sample of 186 societies. In about a third of those societies, one of the standard ways of getting a wife is to capture her from another
Even
village.
these days.
Now, we'd call that rape today. But in those societies, it's a sort of standard operating procedure. I'm glad I don't live in one, but I think it helps to understand something about the variation that exists across human societies and other species.
Well, one of the other things in your book is what's regarded as desirable, and how that can then come to be influence the body types even.
Oh, absolutely. This is fascinating. Cross-culturally, there is an amazing uniformity in what's considered beautiful in a woman and what's considered desirable in a man. If you look at women for a minute, there are things that are purely cultural. Straight hair, curly hair, lots of vigorous pubic hair, very little pubic hair. Those things are cultural. But there's a real core group of things that have to do with youth, health, and vitality. And some of them are surprising. One of the fun things about using the behavioral and evolutionary ecology is that you can often make counterintuitive predictions that are testable. One of the amazing outcomes of doing that is some work by Dev Singh in which he found a very widespread preference across all kinds of cultures. Cultures that like really Rubenesque, zaftig women, cultures that like really slender women. Nonetheless, everybody likes a waist-to-hip ratio of about 7 to 10. Well, it boils down to this. A noticeable waist means I'm young, I'm not pregnant, and I'm healthy. And that's because the way we put fat on our bodies differs with sex and age. Little babies put fat on their fingers and faces and toes. Little boys, little girls, teenage boys, grown men, old men, and postmenopausal women put fat all over their bodies. But reproductive aged women, probably through the action of estrogen, put fat preferentially on their breasts, hips, and buttocks. Now, the breasts and hips might be confusing signals. The buttock is literally, it's very strongly associated with harsh environments. And it literally means, even in this crummy environment, I can not only survive, but I can store fat. And so too does the waist, noticeable waist, tell you that you're not postmenopausal. And we even cheat today, right? You can have liposuction to give you your waist back once you're postmenopausal.
One of the other things you looked at in terms of this is that the use, the search for and use of resources to enhance reproductive success.
This is at the core of our lives, and we never think about it. I was drawn to ask this question about humans because it's such a non-issue. In every other species you can imagine, it's very clear. It's almost not a question worth testing once again in yet another species. It's straightforwardly true that especially males who have more variance in their reproductive success, those who have the most resources, whether it's status, whether it's territory, whether it's some other resource you can give to a female, the males who have the most get the most matings, have the most children, have the most great-great-great-grandchildren, other things being equal. And yet, if you walk down the street today and ask the first 10 people you met, how, if at all, do wealth and resources sort of correlate or show any pattern with family size or reproduction? So far, my count is about 7 out of 10 will tell you it's a negative relationship. two of them will say there's a relationship, and one will think it's positive. And that's because we've measured the wrong things and we haven't asked this question in humans. And that's, in fact, what led me to ask about it and look cross-culturally at people's work on exactly this question.
It is a fascinating finding.
Well, it's an interesting and possibly scary finding, because what you find is that if you look within a society, for those societies for which we have data and there is a lot of variation in resources or status, them that's got shall get. The wealthier men get more children. And this is true even in societies where you wouldn't expect it. I mentioned 19th century Sweden. That was a Lutheran country, no divorce, almost no out-of-wedlock births, very egalitarian social rules, care, nobody was allowed to starve to death, people were sort of modulated, nobody was super wealthy, nobody was really poor. Even there, in the times and places in which men had variation in wealth, basically it boiled down to, even though they married late, wealthy men married younger women and had the same, what we call inter-birth interval, ended up with about one more child, 1.5 more children than other men.
I'm tempted to talk about Gerson Keeler's Norwegian Bachelor.
There are a lot. That was actually a big phenomenon in Sweden as well as Norway. There were lots of unmarried Norwegian bachelors. And when a woman died, wealthy men remarried much more than poor men.
It's also, we've been talking about how this impacts on sexual strategies for mating.
Well, that's true. And that's almost entirely a very deep interaction between cultural norms and our evolutionary past and our drives. That's why, for instance, if it may be true that men capture women for wives in a large number of societies, but it wouldn't work here.
Another aspect of this is the issue of fertility, and I'm sure that people don't think about that consciously.
Absolutely true. In fact, one of the reasons we have so much trouble thinking about natural selection and this wealth and fertility problem is that in places like the United States today, our family sizes are very small. Now, it's interesting that there's a biological parallel to this. It's a much misused theory, but the bottom line of it is when the environment is very competitive and you must make big, tough super babies in order for them to be competitive, you'll do that. And if you do that, unless you yourself get bigger or get a faster metabolic rate, you must make fewer offspring. So demographic transitions, going from more babies with less investment to fewer babies with more investment, is a wider spread phenomenon than just humans. But here's the trouble. There are two deep-seated evolutionary pieces of our past that may cause trouble for us today. One is the drive to get resources and use them to build families. That's a pattern that's very widespread in the developing nations today. Pretty large families, generally wealthier families, they never have fewer babies than the poorest families. But that's a heavy population growth. Now, the Western developed nations have undergone this demographic transition. They have few children. But what we've done in our situation is reduced family size to about a half or even a fourth of that of the developing nations. However, we've increased our per capita consumption to about 10 or 15 times. If you worry, as many biologists do, about sustainability, neither side is doing much for sustainability.
One of the other issues that you're talking about that I was thinking about is the genetic manipulation and the research and concepts of designer babies where, excuse me, people are manipulating the genes or the, the product of their sexual activity so they can have a specific type. Did you think about that?
Well, it's an interesting piece. We have made our environment novel in so many ways. And all a biologist can tell you is that if we do things that really hurt our individual survivorship and reproduction, in the end we won't keep doing it very long. The last few Shakers who impose celibacy on their members are dying out today. And I have colleagues in India and South Korea in which technology was really very useful in terms of using ultrasound, determining the sex of your baby, and choosing. In China, too, although I haven't the first-hand knowledge, there was this issue of being able to choose. Now, there's a very strong son preference in these countries, and when getting to choose your baby's sex interacted with that, what's happened is, in South Korea, I know more because I have friends there whose children are undergoing this. Everybody chose to have sons. Now, their sons are in about the 3rd grade, and there are almost no little girls in class. And suddenly, parents are thinking about, who's my son going to marry?
Whoops.
And it's become, little girls are becoming valuable again. So designer babies may turn out to be a very interesting experiment. I wouldn't venture to imagine what might come out of it, but it'll be fun to see how natural selection interacts with our ability to decide to do this.
The other thing that was fascinating about this discussion of human behavior is the way you look at these interactions in the individual and societal and species dimensions.
Well, it's a tough question, and I would say I'm only beginning to scratch the surface. I said a moment ago that natural selection was amoral. That's really true. An elephant seal male will do whatever he can get away with. And humans, because we live in groups, because we depend so deeply on each other. A lot of the life history pieces I was talking about before, women couldn't have children close together if they had to do all of their own food gathering and all of the nutrition for the infant. So even deep things like our life histories are tied to the fact that we're very social. Because we're very social, we can't get away with being too nasty to people we need to interact with.
Very good. Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Pleasure.